Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight for our 18 News digital exclusive State of the Virus. And now we are past the one-year mark of COVID-19 disrupting the lives of billions of people around the world. While we're not completely out of the woods yet, we can now see the light at the end of the tunnel thanks to the COVID-19 vaccine. Now today we're joined once again by Dr. Michael Scalzone, Chief Quality Officer for Guthrie. Thank you for joining us today, Doctor.
You're welcome, George. Good to see you.
All right, so Doctor, things are continuing to look good in our area regarding the virus. What are you seeing in the hospital as well as in our community?
So we're seeing a little bit of a relief, and that's really nice for our staff and for our patients. As we see the trends in the communities that we serve going down, we continue to see the hospitalizations go down. It's not quite as rapid a drop as we saw in January and early February. It has plateaued a little bit, but the trend continues to be positive. So we're optimistic and we're hopeful that as more vaccine is available, that trend will continue.
All right, so we're seeing more of these public and pop-up vaccination clinics come up around our area, but there are still people who are struggling to find a vaccine. So can we just remind our viewers the best place to look for a vaccine and what they'll need to be able to get one?
Right. So the easiest way and the way that New York State is guiding it is at their website. So you just click on New York State, am I eligible, on the New York State Department of Health website, and you can Google that. You'll be able to look to see if your eligibility is available, and you'll be able to find places where there are appointments. There'll also be a phone number there so that you can hold on to that phone number in case you don't have access to the internet, or in case you need someone to give assistance with that. So you could have a friend or family member or someone else make that phone call so that you can find a place to get a vaccine.
All right, and right now, even though the supply of the vaccine is increasing, the eligibility kind of remains low, especially for our area. Are we seeing more supply than demand right now for the vaccine? And what's going to happen if we do have all these vaccines available that cannot be used?
Well, I think that we continue to have a demand that outstrips the supply. It is nice that we're getting more and more vaccine, but we're not at that point yet where we have access. And I don't anticipate that for a number of months to come. So we have, in a stepwise fashion, increased the number of people who are eligible. And while it does take a little bit longer to fill the schedules than it did a couple of weeks ago, we recently opened a few hundred vaccine appointments, and within a couple hours, those appointments were filled. And so there still continues to be a strong demand. And I think at least through the summer and early fall, there will not be an excess.
All right, so in the last couple months, we've heard a lot of different terms, one of them being fully vaccinated. So what's the difference between someone who has been vaccinated and someone who has been fully vaccinated? What does someone who has been fully vaccinated, what does that allow them to do now?
So that's a great question, and we hear that quite a bit from our patients. So for the initial two vaccines that were approved, the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, it required 2 shots. So after the first injection, they have a partial immunization profile. And what that means is that your body is beginning to produce a response that will protect you, but it's not a complete response yet. And so it requires both injections and then several weeks afterwards. It always takes several weeks following the final dose in order to have the maximum amount of antibody response, which is what is protective. So what we know is you get a partial response, usually estimated at about 50% reduction in your risk after a single injection. And then you get the full response after the second injection, which is more like 90-95%. In the case of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, where there's just one dose, fully vaccinated is 2 weeks following that. What the CDC just recently said, good news that I think we've talked about before, is those that are fully vaccinated, defined as 2 weeks following the final dose, can gather with other fully vaccinated individuals in small groups safely with less precautions, less social distancing or masking. So that is a very nice step in the right direction for vaccination to help us with.
All right, of course, Doctor, a lot of people have put off travel because of the virus. I have not been outside of New York or Pennsylvania since last February. I haven't been on a plane since November of 2019. So when can we expect people to safely board a plane, even if they just have to wear a mask to get through that trip?
Yeah. So we're not quite there yet. And I know that people are anxious because the spring is nearly here and summer is around the corner. But planes still are somewhat of an increased risk, and there are still requirements for international travel. So that's really important to know. If someone is looking to take an international trip, there's a testing requirement before and a testing requirement afterwards. So that makes it a little more complex. And the CDC is still recommending that airline travel be mostly for essential reasons. Now, having said that, for those that are fully vaccinated and for domestic travel, we do see that more and more people are flying. And that is probably reasonable with the precautions of masking and distancing whenever available. So it's, again, something that's evolving. I don't know that we'll get any more specific guidance for at least a few weeks or months until we see how many people become vaccinated.
All right, we've talked a lot about how there's different variants of the virus. They're out there, and the science regarding how the vaccine works with them wasn't quite certain for each shot and each different variant. What do we now know about how the different shots protect against the three main variants that we've heard a lot of?
Right. So the scientists are trying to break it down into several different levels. They call them variants of interest, variants of concern, and variants of higher concern, for lack of a better way to put it. And what that means is some of these mutations, some of these variants, while are a different strain, they really don't have a clinical difference in how they present with disease or if the vaccine would be effective. Variants of concern, which is the category that the three main variants that we're seeing now are, means that the potential for increased transmission exists or the potential for decreased effectiveness of vaccines. Now, what we're seeing is currently that the vaccines are still effective against these variants. From a clinical perspective, there is some theoretical information based on laboratory responsiveness of the antibodies produced after vaccination and the virus in the lab. But clinically, we are seeing that for the most part, these vaccines are effective against the variants. And particularly with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, it was actually tested in a broad number of individuals in those countries where those variants were first identified. And so while this is something we're going to continue to watch, we still have reasonable confidence that these vaccines are effective against the currently existing variants.
All right, and also this week, Moderna announced that they're continuing their testing on the vaccine with children. What do we know about this study, and when can we expect more guidance when it comes to children getting whether it's the Moderna shot or some of the other ones that are out there?
So as I think everyone knows, the initial studies didn't include children, and that's pretty typical. When you're doing an initial study of a vaccine or a new product like this, when it's not specifically targeted just for children, it's pretty typical to begin with an adult population. What happened then is Pfizer back in December began to expand their studies to those individuals between 12 and 16, and so that's ongoing. Moderna has been even broader. They have now started a study that will include up to 4,000 individuals between ages 6 months and 16 years. So that will give us a lot of information about both the safety and the effectiveness. It's a sort of a multi-part study. They're looking at both what dose is effective as well as a safety profile. So it's going to be at least 2 to 3 months before they have the 2 cohorts available to be tested to see how effective this is. So it's exciting news. It's important to remember that less than 10% of cases that have been identified have been in children, and less than 0.1% of the fatalities have been in children. And most of those were individuals with other serious medical conditions. So while it's very concerning for our children to get COVID, no one wants our children to be ill in any way, shape, or form. It's important to recognize that the disease does seem to be less common and less serious in the younger population.
All right, and of course, talking about the vaccines, we've talked about the 3 different ones available in the United States, but the AstraZeneca vaccine has not been approved here, and some countries are now starting to pull the shot. Can you tell us a little bit about this shot, both why the U.S. hasn't approved it and why some of these other countries are now pulling it?
Sure. The simple reason why the U.S. hasn't approved it is they haven't applied yet for the emergency use authorization. They anticipate doing that in the next several weeks. there are two parts to the AstraZeneca vaccine that have been slightly different during the studies. Earlier, back in December, during the initial phases of their trial, they did have one or two patients with a complication, and they needed to pause and try to determine whether that was related to the vaccine or not. The evidence was good that it was not, and so the vaccine trial continued. After it was approved in the UK and other places, it's now been given to millions of individuals. And they have found that a few people who've been vaccinated have formed blood clots. Now, what's important in a scientific study like this, or in looking at two cohorts of individuals, is that there's the natural incidence of these types of conditions that are going to happen. So if you take a population of 50,000 individuals, some of those individuals are going to have a medical condition with a blood clot. And so what you need to do is to look at the frequency. Is it more common or equally common following the vaccine? Right now, it appears that it is equally or less common to form these blood clots after being vaccinated. That makes us believe that this is sort of statistically insignificant. And while some of these nations are choosing out of an abundance of caution to pause the vaccinations, most experts are suggesting that this is not a significant problem. And given the seriousness of the pandemic in different regions of the world, pausing vaccination with AstraZeneca could impact increasing rates. So most experts are saying hopefully this will be a very slow pause, very short, and be able to continue with vaccination, because we need every one of these vaccines that's safe and effective to be out there.
Of course, and over the last course of 5 or 6 months that we've been taping this show, we've talked a lot. Before the vaccine, we were talking a lot about testing. And of course, before we had the vaccine clinics, we had the mass testing sites. So where do we stand right now on testing? How has testing changed since we started back in last March?
I would say testing has changed in 3 ways. First, it's much more available. So there were manufacturing challenges, there were supply chain challenges, there was distribution challenges. It was very difficult to find a test, and we all know that. It's interesting how this pandemic in different waves has had different challenges each step of the way, whether it was PPE, whether it's testing, hospital capacity, vaccination. There's been a new challenge every few months. So testing is now widely available. It's widely available in physicians' offices, testing sites. And so compared to what was available, say, back in May or June, it's much easier to get a test. The second part is that it's easier to get a rapid test. And so rapid tests are much more available, which of course is much more useful from the patient standpoint, and much more useful to know who needs to be quarantined, who needs to be isolated to help prevent spread. So testing is in a much better place. The third part of testing is, in some areas, there's less testing happening. Some are concerned about that, but really what we need to understand is that sometimes less testing is because there's less incidence, so there's less contacts, less contact tracing requiring testing. In our region, the amount of testing is about stable. It has not changed significantly in the last few months. So as we see decreasing rates, we feel very comfortable that's truly a decreasing incidence in disease in our areas. So those are the things I think have changed with testing, and it's nice to have that as an option for us.
All right, of course, finally, Doctor, what are some of the things that you need our viewers to know right now as the vaccine does become more available and as the world slowly begins to open up once again?
I think there's 2 parts to emphasize, and one we've talked about a few times, in that the vaccine is truly safe and effective. And I know that you will find concerns, but we now have literally 110 million doses that have been given of the COVID vaccine across the country. And the risk of serious events is very, very minimal. So beyond just the 150,000 people that were in those trials, there's now real world evidence of hundreds of millions of individuals that have been vaccinated safely. So it is our best tool to be able to combat this pandemic, and we really need to encourage getting the vaccine to everyone that it's eligible for, and we'll keep working for that. The second is that it's really tempting to relax. And although we are starting to get some guidance about things we can do more freely, such as gather in households of fully vaccinated individuals, there's still a significant amount of coronavirus out there. And we see that as our incidence has plateaued a little bit and not continued to drop steeply. So as difficult as it is, it really is not a time to completely relax, and we need to stay vigilant.
Very important there. Of course, Dr. Scalzone, thank you for joining us today. And viewers, if you have a question regarding COVID-19 or the vaccine that you would like one of our local experts to answer, you can email us at news@WETMTV.com. And we're going to have a special episode coming up with a panel of some of our local experts, so be on the lookout for that. Viewers, thank you for joining us tonight, and have a good night.